I arrived at the hospital to be with my son following his motorcycle accident. He had broken legs, and the doctors feared he might be paralyzed. For 3 days straight, I remained at his bedside, witnessing his agony. During one of those nights while he was sleeping, a nurse discreetly pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm. The note contained a cryptic warning that he was deceiving me and urged me to review the security camera footage from 2 a.m. the previous night. The message left me bewildered. My son was barely able to move his body. This accusation seemed impossible. Yet something about the nurse's urgent manner disturbed me deeply, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to investigate. What the security footage ultimately revealed left me absolutely horrified. The overhead fluorescent bulbs in Hospital Room 412 at Rhode Island Hospital emitted a faint buzzing sound on that late November evening. I sat crumpled in the uncomfortable vinyl chair positioned next to my son's bed, every part of my body aching for rest. 3 full days had passed since I received the devastating phone call informing me that Elias had been involved in a serious motorcycle crash on Route 6. My name is Cornelius Whitaker. I'm 68 years old, a retired electrical engineer who has been living as a widower for the past 5 years. As I watched my only child lying there in that hospital bed, pale and severely injured, I felt the weight of every single one of those years bearing down on me. Elias's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper when he called out to me. I immediately leaned closer to hear him. He asked for water, his face contorting with obvious pain as he attempted to shift his position. The traction device holding his leg in place resembled some kind of medieval torture apparatus. He weakly suggested that I should return home and get proper sleep. I insisted I was comfortable right where I was. He protested that I looked exhausted and reminded me that Isolde would return in the morning. Isolde was his wife of 3 years. She had been at the hospital earlier, appearing anxious and concerned before leaving to check on their son Finian. I had always considered her a good woman, managing everything while Elias recovered. The door opened quietly, and a night nurse walked in. Her identification badge read, Lavinia Harlow. She appeared to be in her early 40s with a competent demeanor and kind but weary eyes. She announced it was time to check vital signs and move toward the monitors. She adjusted the IV drip, reviewed the readouts, and made notes on her tablet. Everything seemed routine. However, something suddenly changed. As she turned to exit the room, she paused beside my chair. Her hand reached out as though she was going to adjust the blanket draped over the armrest. Her fingers made contact with mine, and I suddenly felt something small and folded being pressed into my hand. It was paper. My eyes immediately shot up to look at her face. Lavinia was staring straight ahead with a professionally neutral expression, yet there was something in her gaze when it briefly met mine that conveyed both warning and urgency. She turned and walked out without saying anything. My heart was pounding rapidly as I slowly unfolded the paper in my lap, keeping it concealed from Elias's view. The handwriting appeared rushed, but was still legible. The message stated that he was lying and instructed me to check the cameras from 2 a.m. the previous night. I read those words repeatedly. The note claimed he was lying. I looked up at my son. Elias's eyes were now closed, his breathing settling into the steady rhythm induced by pain medication. This was my boy whom I had taught to ride a bicycle, who had cried on my shoulder when his mother passed away. Yet this note was telling me he was lying. But why would a nurse warn me about my own son? My hands trembled as I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. The room suddenly felt much colder. I had spent 3 days sitting in that room, watching him suffer, holding his hand and promising him that everything would be fine. Now this tiny piece of paper was suggesting that none of it might be genuine. Dawn had not yet broken when I drove away from Rhode Island Hospital, but I didn't head toward home. I needed a quiet place to think, somewhere to decide whether I truly wanted to know the truth. The all-night diner on Eddy Street was nearly deserted. I slid into a corner booth with a cup of black coffee cooling in front of me and unfolded the crumpled note. Memories surfaced without my permission. Elias angling his phone away whenever I entered the room. Isolde mentioning too casually how much the house must be worth these days. The way he would wince dramatically for visitors yet seemed comfortable when only the two of us were present. I had ignored all of these signs, telling myself that grief and exhaustion were making me paranoid. I needed to know. Whatever the cost, I needed to understand who my son really was. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in years. Thaddeus Blackwell and I had worked together back in the 80s before he left engineering to become a private investigator. He answered after the third ring. I told him I needed his assistance. I explained it involved my son, Elias, who was in the hospital following a motorcycle accident, but I suspected he might be lying about his injuries. Silence followed. Then he asked what made me think that. I told him a nurse had slipped me a note instructing me to check the security footage from his room at 2 a.m. Thaddeus responded carefully, noting that hospital cameras weren't easy to access and that once I saw something, I couldn't unsee it. He asked if I was certain. I told him I had to know, even if the truth destroyed me. After another pause, he agreed and said to give him 2 hours to get me access. I drove back to the hospital parking lot and waited in my car with my laptop balanced on my knees. At 8:15, my phone buzzed. Thaddeus had sent a link with instructions to watch it alone. One click was all it would take. I understood that some truths, once known, can never be unknown. However, I was already past the point of no return. I clicked the link. The screen flickered and then displayed a grainy overhead view of room 412. The timestamp showed 2:03 in the morning. The screen came to life and my world began to fall apart. I watched myself on the screen, hunched over and exhausted, shuffling out of the room. The door closed and silence filled the room. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then at 2:03, his eyes snapped open. Not slowly or painfully, just open, sharp, and alert. He turned his head left and then right, listening carefully and making sure he was alone. At 2:05, he sat up without any groan or hesitation. He pushed himself upright smoothly and easily, like someone who had never been injured at all. Both legs, including the supposedly paralyzed left one and the shattered right thigh bone, swung over the side of the bed. There was no shaking or weakness. My hands went numb on the steering wheel. He reached beneath his pillow and pulled out his phone. At 2:07, he scrolled through it with a relaxed face, even smiling. At 2:08, the door opened and Isolde slipped inside. She was carrying a large paper bag from a fast food restaurant. At 2:10, she handed him the bag. He opened it to reveal a burger, fries, and soda, and he ate. Not carefully or gingerly. He ate like a healthy 35-year-old man would. They talked while he chewed, their mouths moving silently as they shared smiles. My chest tightened as though a fist was closing around my heart. At 2:12, Elias laughed. He threw his head back in a carefree manner. Isolde sat on the edge of the bed, and they continued talking. Their interaction was easy, intimate, and conspiratorial. At 2:15, he clapped her shoulder. She gathered the trash, erasing any evidence. She leaned down and kissed his forehead before leaving. Elias lay back down, tucked his phone under the pillow, pulled the blanket up, and closed his eyes. Within seconds, he looked exactly as he had before, appearing broken, helpless, and suffering. I stared at the black screen. The realization came to me cold and factual that he could walk. All those hours I had spent sitting by his bed, holding his hand while he pretended to suffer, listening to him beg me not to leave and express fear about never walking again. Every single word had been a lie. The question of why echoed where my heart used to be. Why would he lie? I remembered Isolde repeatedly mentioning how much the house must be worth so much now. My house, the Victorian on Benefit Street, was paid off and in my name. The pieces locked together with sickening clarity. I drove home in absolute silence. When the car stopped in front of the old Victorian, the house Eudora and I had built over 40 years, a cold clarity struck me. This was what my son wanted to take from me. I walked through the front gate past Eudora's rose garden. Inside, the living room smelled of old wood and lemon polish. Our wedding photo hung above the fireplace. 40 years of memories, and my son wanted to sell it all. I opened my laptop and changed every password for my bank accounts, investments, and email. Then I pulled the property deed from the cabinet and locked it in the safe. I called the bank and instructed them to freeze any large transactions. My phone rang. It was Thaddeus telling me he had dug deeper and that things were worse than I thought. He explained that Elias's surgeon, Dr. Peregrine Lockwood, had received $15,000 from an account tied to Elias. It was a bribe, and it had been paid a week before the accident. My stomach dropped at the realization that they had planned everything. Thaddeus continued, explaining that he had accessed the MRI records and found no spinal damage whatsoever. However, Dr. Lockwood had reported severe compression, requiring immediate surgery costing $275,000. The diagnosis had been completely fabricated. There was more. Elias owed $180,000 from a failed real estate deal. They had planned to purchase my house for $450,000, flip it, and split the profit. I closed my eyes as the truth locked together with sickening precision. My son had bribed a doctor, staged an accident, faked paralysis, and manipulated me into selling my home below its value to cover his debts. I walked over to the small table where Eudora's photo rested. I whispered that I had failed her. Then I heard her voice in my memory telling me I was stronger than I thought and not to let anyone take what was ours. I sent a text message to Thaddeus stating that tomorrow I would return to the hospital. His reply came immediately asking what I was going to do. I stared at the screen and then typed that this time I would be the actor. The next morning, I stood before the bathroom mirror. The soft gaze of a trusting father was gone. In its place were the cold, clear eyes of a man who had been betrayed. That day I would perform just as my son had done for 3 days. When I entered room 412, I wore the mask of a devoted father. Elias's voice trembled weakly as he asked if I had come back. I replied that of course I had and sat beside the bed, taking his hand. His skin was warm and real. Everything else about him was a lie. The door opened and Isolde walked in carrying a thermal container. Her smile was bright and gentle. She remarked that I looked exhausted. She told me not to worry and assured me he was going to be fine. Her eyes flicked toward Elias for a brief, calculated second. I noticed, but said nothing. She said she needed to talk to me about finances. She mentioned the surgery that cost $275,000 and explained that the insurance company had denied the claim. I let shock cross my face and asked how we were supposed to pay for it. Isolde hesitated with perfect timing before saying she had an idea. She explained that a friend of hers was a real estate broker who had a buyer interested in a house on Benefit Street. If I sold my home, we could pay for the surgery immediately. I stared at her and let silence stretch out. Elias's voice broke as he said he didn't want me to lose my home because of him. He paused and then whispered that he didn't want to spend his life in a wheelchair and that he was scared. I looked at him, my son, crying on cue like a seasoned actor. Inside, I wanted to scream. Outside, I squeezed his hand and told him to let me think about it. The next 2 days passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Each morning I returned to the hospital and performed the role of the worried father. Elias and Isolde kept pressing about the house, and I kept repeating that I needed to think about it. However, inside I was preparing for something entirely different. On Saturday evening, I sat across from Thaddeus in his office. Evidence covered his desk. The tablet sat ready with the video queued up. Bank transfer receipts, MRI scans, credit statements, and contracts lay spread out before us. Thaddeus noted that this was enough to go to the police right away. I said evenly that it wasn't time yet, because I needed to hear my son admit it to my face. Thaddeus pointed out that this was going to hurt. I acknowledged that I knew, but explained that I needed closure. Back home, I made 3 phone calls. First, I called Serafina and told her I needed her at the hospital the next morning as a witness. Second, I called Archibald, my old friend from the engineering firm. Third, I called Godfrey. the hospital security guard. After making the calls, I stood before Eudora's photo on the mantel from our wedding day. I said softly that tomorrow I would protect this house for her and for us. The next morning, the hospital hallway felt quieter than usual. Each step toward room 412 felt like wading through concrete. Thaddeus walked beside me carrying a black folder stuffed with evidence. Serafina and Archibald waited near the door. Godfrey gave me a small nod. Everyone was ready. I pushed the door open. Elias looked up from his bed and smiled, remarking that I was there early and dressed up. Isolde stood beside him arranging flowers. I didn't smile as I walked in. Thaddeus followed me. Serafina and Archibald stepped into the doorway behind us. Elias's smile faltered as his eyes flicked between the faces in the room. My voice was calm and flat as I noted that he was asking what was going on. Isolde asked if I had made a decision about the house. I replied that I had, but that before I told them, I wanted to show them something. Thaddeus placed the tablet on the rolling tray beside Elias. I replied that it was the truth and tapped the screen before pressing play. Black and white security footage filled the screen. Elias sat up in bed with no pain and no hesitation. He swung both legs over the side, stood up, and walked. Isolde entered carrying a paper bag with a burger and fries. Elias ate, smiled, and laughed, all while I had believed he was paralyzed. The room went silent. No one moved or spoke. The video ended. Elias's face turned white and sweat beaded on his forehead. Isolde cracked first, her voice shrill as she demanded to know where I had gotten that. I turned to her slowly. My voice was like ice as I explained that was my son at 2 a.m. after I had gone home exhausted. I pointed at the tablet and described how he had sat up, walked, and laughed while I believed he might never walk again. Elias finally spoke, his voice weak as he said he could explain. I demanded to know what he would explain, how he had walked while telling me he was paralyzed, how he had eaten burgers while I spoon-fed him soup. He flinched and said nothing. The door opened and Dr. Peregrine Lockwood stepped inside. He stopped when his eyes landed on the tablet. The color left his face. I turned toward him and noted that his timing was perfect. Thaddeus opened the folder to reveal 2 MRI reports inside. I held them up and explained that one was real and one was fake. I pointed to the first image and said this was my son's original MRI showing no spinal injury whatsoever. Then I lifted the second report, which was Dr. Lockwood's diagnosis claiming severe compression, requiring immediate surgery at an estimated cost of $275,000. I looked directly at him and noted that these 2 documents did not match. I placed the bank transfer receipt beside the reports and stated that $15,000 had been transferred from Elias's account to his 1 week before the accident. Lavinia stepped forward and stated that she had reviewed the original MRI herself and there had been no spinal damage. Dr. Lockwood stood frozen and exposed. Elias broke down, covering his face and sobbing as he said he was sorry, and that he had owed so much money and didn't know what else to do. I told him he had a choice. My voice cut through his crying as I explained that he could have asked me for help or told me the truth, but instead he chose to lie. The words burst out of me as I accused him of deciding to steal my house, the home his mother and I had built over 40 years. Elias collapsed inward, unable to answer. I inhaled shakily and said that for 35 years I had raised him. My voice cracked as I admitted I had thought he was my pride. However, I now realized something as I looked at him fully. I told him I didn't have a son anymore. He pleaded with me not to leave him, insisting he was still my son. I turned away and told him he had left me first when he chose deception. I walked toward the door and said he had left me a long time ago. He called out to me, but I didn't turn back. I said goodbye to Elias. In the hallway, my legs nearly gave out. Serafina steadied me while Archibald gripped my shoulder. Godfrey approached and informed me that the police had just arrived. 2 weeks passed in a blur. Dr. Lockwood was suspended and investigated for medical fraud. Elias was questioned for attempted fraud and insurance deception. Isolde disappeared. my house remained mine. I never visited Elias. Letters came every day containing apologies and pleas. I didn't open them. A month later, December had settled over Providence and snow covered the rose garden outside my window. Serafina had invited me to Christmas dinner. Archibald called often. Godfrey brought coffee. My grandson Finian sent a drawing that I taped to the fridge. Life moved forward slowly and painfully. Snow fell softly outside the window. Serafina sat beside me sipping hot tea. Clementine brought apple pie. Finian, my 9-year-old grandson, still visited every weekend. I realized something important, which was that I wasn't alone. Serafina remarked that I seemed different, lighter somehow. I told her I was learning to let go. She smiled and said, Eudora would be proud of me. On Saturday afternoon, Octavia, who was Elias's ex-wife, dropped Finian off. I knelt to Finian's height and asked if he wanted to go to the park. He enthusiastically agreed. At the park, we walked along the frozen paths. Finian looked up at me, asking if I still loved his dad. I stopped as the question hung in the cold air. I told him slowly that I would always love the boy his father used to be, but I couldn't forgive the man he had become. Back home, I stood in the rose garden. The bushes were bare and covered in frost. Yet at the edge, one red rose bloomed despite it being winter. I smiled and spoke aloud, asking Eudora if she could see that her roses still bloomed and noting that I was still there. People say family is everything. I learned that isn't always true. Sometimes family hurts you the most. Sometimes love brings betrayal. I learned that love doesn't require accepting abuse. Forgiveness isn't mandatory for achieving peace. Self-respect matters more than blood. This house still stands, built by Eudora and me. Her roses bloom every spring. Even in winter, one flower dares to grow, and I'm still here. I chose myself, and that doesn't make me selfish. It makes me human. If you face betrayal from someone you love, remember this truth. You don't have to choose between them and yourself. Sometimes protecting yourself is the greatest form of love. You aren't alone. People will stand beside you because of who you are. Serafina, Archibald, Clementine, and Finian are my family now. Family isn't defined by DNA. It's defined by loyalty and kindness, by showing up when it matters. Finian ran in with wide eyes, exclaiming that it was snowing harder and asking if we could build a snowman. I stood up smiling and told him we should go. We bundled up and stepped outside where snow swirled softly. Finian laughed and ran ahead. I looked back at the house where warm light glowed from the windows. That single red rose still bloomed. My name is Cornelius Whitaker, and I'm 68 years old. I lost my wife 5 years ago. I lost my son, or at least the son I thought I had. However, I did not lose myself. Family isn't about blood. It's about who stands beside you. I found my family through kindness and choice. Looking back at my story, I see a father who trusted too much and questioned too little. Don't ignore the warning signs because you're afraid of what you'll find. Love your family, yes, but never at the cost of your dignity. I thank God every day for people like Serafina, Archibald, and little Finian, who are proof that family is built on love and not blood. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and self-respect? How did you find peace? Your story might help someone else. Remember that you are worth more than anyone's betrayal. Thank you for listening, and God bless you.